This is a special live edition of Backyard History, starring Andrew McLean, Fredericton Mayor Kate Rogers, New Brunswick MLA David Coon, Fredericton Poet Laureate Fawn Parker, New Brunswick MLA Luke Randall, and Fredericton City Councillor Cassandra LeBlanc. Stay tuned for a special Q&A at the end of the episode, hosted by the host of CBC Radio's Information Morning Fredericton, Jean Armstrong.
So today we're going to be talking about a name that I think you guys all know, Muriel McQueen Ferguson. But you know how sometimes you've got the hit Hollywood movies, but before that they'll put out a prequel? This is kind of like the prequel, the story of someone that you know before she was famous. This is her meteoric rise to fame, which was right here in Fredericton. It was kind of an odd beginning to how I got started with this tale. I was at the Provincial Archives doing research, as I often do for Backyard History. And another person that it would be a regular there would be City Councillor Eric McGarity. And do you remember when you were in school, you'd have like a kid behind you at the desk and he would be like, "Hey, do you know the answer to question 14? Well, Councillor McGarity was like, "Hey, do you know when Fredericton women got the right to vote?" I was like, I don't know. Shouldn't you know this? But it got me thinking. I just assumed it was 1919 when it came in federally and provincially, right? But he cryptically said, "Oh, I think it was a lot later than that." So I started looking into this. I started going on a quest. I couldn't find it on the internet or easy ways like that. So I started digging through the archives documents, and I came across this really cool old poem on kind of like tattered paper, tape still on it where it had been stuck to a wall. And some of the lines in it said,
"Then to the women, thought of their wrongs came flocking. 'Tis clear," cried they, "our mayor's a naughty, and as for our city council, shocking. Rouse up, sirs, give your brain a racking, or sure as fate will send you packing."
So this poem was written for a victory party, and it was kind of an odd thing because I'm like following this old poem like a treasure map, except this isn't an old treasure map, right? This is from 1950. Like my grandparents were firmly adults by this point, right? But yet, I guess it kind of is a testament to how much work there is for to keep track of women's history, right? But I'm still after this like very basic question, and it took me on all of these dramatic twists through history, because not only did Fredericton women were very late to get the vote municipally, in a strange twist of fate, they'd actually, centuries before, been some of the earliest, not in just in locally, but in the world, to have the vote. But that right to vote was taken away, and then they became among some of the last Canadians to ever get this back. So Muriel McQueen Ferguson, it's this name we know so well, and she got her start here in Fredericton when she was a alderman. The word alderman is what we now call city councillor. I didn't see anything in the old sources calling her alderwoman or alder person. It was always the woman alderman, which is how the newspapers called it. So on November 28th, 1950, Muriel McQueen Ferguson had this lavish press conference at the luxurious Beaverbrook Hotel to announce that she would be the first ever woman to run for alderman in the election that would be happening that coming January. Local politics weren't particularly exciting at the time at Fredericton, unlike today. The same mayor and city council back then had been elected 6 consecutive times. But this time something different was happening. Something big was clearly happening in Fredericton. So Muriel McQueen Ferguson, she strode up to the podium in the limelights, not unlike today. She had all of these rapturous cheering crowds that packed the room. They included everyone from housewives to engineers to students to professors to plumbers to photographers, lumberjacks, and librarians. There were men, women, Catholics, Anglicans, and Jewish people. And when announcing her candidacy, she declared,
It will be an exciting election.
It would, in fact, not be an exciting election. Nobody would even put in their name to run against her. And so on January 11th, 1951, Fredericton made history when Muriel McQueen Ferguson was acclaimed to be, in the words of the Daily Gleaner newspaper,
first woman to become alderman.
That poem I found in the archives amidst her papers had been written by her friends to be read at her victory party that was happening that night. And it ended with the lines,
"Now we all proudly boast of our first alderman. To you I must give this toast, Muriel Ferguson."
So only 2 years later, Muriel McQueen Ferguson was appointed senator, and she was launched into the national and soon the international spotlight. And that's kind of where her story the famous story of her kind of begins, with this quick rise to international stardom, walking into the limelight with cheering crowds and all this support that no one is even going to run against her. But, I mean, that's no way to start a story, is it? With the cheering crowds, how on earth did she become so popular in the first place? And this poem her friends wrote for her victory party, it begins with,
"When begins my ditty almost 6 or 7 years ago, to see the women folk suffer so from lack of vote, what was a pity."
So before becoming a senator, before running unopposed to become a woman alderman, Muriel McQueen Ferguson had first led an effort to allow women the right to vote in the very. So Muriel McQueen Ferguson had first come to Fredericton in 1944. Before that, she had been a small-town lawyer, but she put that job aside to open a tea cafe in Grand Falls. So that was shortly after marrying her husband. Her husband got sick, and she closed down her tea cafe to go back to lawyering to pay the bills. But not long after he passed away in 1942, she saw something that changed her life. It was a job advertisement, and it said,
"Only men may apply."
So this year is 1944, and the Second World War was on. The job that only men were allowed to apply to was called, this is a big mouthful, the representative in New Brunswick of the Enforcement Division of the Wartime and Prices Trade Board. So just imagine that on a business card. Basically, it was in charge of making sure that grocery stores didn't claim there was inflation in order to gouge customers on food prices. Well, that caused some consternation. So she sent a flurry of letters to these top officials in Ottawa demanding to know why only men may apply. And then the next thing you know, on March 21st, 1944, Fredericton's Daily Gleaner newspaper was writing,
"It was announced today in Ottawa that Muriel McQueen Ferguson, formerly of Grand Falls, New Brunswick, has been appointed Enforcement Counsel in New Brunswick for the Wartime Prices and Trade Board."
So she moved to Fredericton for her new job and almost immediately began her first foray into municipal politics. This appears to have been triggered once again by something she saw. The rules were at the time that before elections you had to publish the rules governing municipal elections in the newspapers. And one of these newspapers in Fredericton had the fateful words,
"Only men may vote."
So in late 1944, Muriel McQueen Ferguson had her first ever interaction with Fredericton's City Council. She attended a meeting, and she delivered a very polite speech asking for 5 words to be added to the Elections Act, which would, in effect, change it enough to allow women to vote. Her speech that she delivered in front of City Hall read in part,
I would like to make it very clear to you that I'm not appearing before you in my office capacity, but only as a woman who is keenly interested in the place that women are going to occupy in the post-war world. I have been giving considerable study to both federal and provincial laws as they relate to women, and from that study, it would seem to me that the trend of legislation is definitely toward giving women more voice in public affairs. Not because this is her right, but because it has been found that she has something to contribute.
So she wasn't actually calling for a grand revolution here. I mean, this is the barest of minimums, right? So Miriam McQueen Ferguson, she went into this meeting incredibly well prepared. She had gotten ready for this meeting by writing letters to the Attorney General of all 9 provinces at the time. Well, 8 out of 9 provinces. Quebec was super opposed to women voting, so she didn't bother with them. But she got letters back in hand from the other Attorney Generals, asking them to clarify their stance on women voting. She explained to the mayor and city council that there was this mess of overlapping rules governing women voting in Canada. Women couldn't vote in Fredericton's local elections, but they could vote federally to choose Canada's prime minister since 1919, which at this point was a quarter of a century earlier. And meanwhile, Fredericton women and all women in New Brunswick could also vote provincially since 1919 as well. So, and this was normal across the Maritimes. PEI women had gotten this in 1922, Nova Scotians in 1918. But meanwhile, these women weren't allowed to vote in their city's elections, not in Fredericton, not in any other city in New Brunswick, although by contrast, they were allowed to in Charlottetown and Halifax, for example, but only if they were housewives. Yeah. By all accounts, Muriel McQueen Ferguson was received very warmly by City Council and the mayor when she gave the speech to her face. As soon as she left the room, though, that attitude changed, and this poem described what happened next.
Muriel McQueen Ferguson called upon the mayor, who sympathized in his dulcet tone, but when he shut the door on them, he wiped his brow and gave a groan.
Shortly after, she received a formal reply from the city, and it said,
"It is submitted that the law is fair. It would be unfair to stop proceedings now in progress. It seems like stopping a game in the middle and changing the rules before finishing it. City Council will therefore decline to ask for any change in the election law."
So, yeah, boo. So Muriel McQueen Ferguson's effort to allow women to vote had been resoundingly rejected by being compared to a sports game. It wasn't always this way, though, because New Brunswick women had actually been amongst some of the first to vote in all of human history. So in a really genuinely shocking twist, it turns out that it might actually have been easier for some women to vote in the 1790s than in the 1940s. So 149 years before Muriel McQueen Ferguson's rejection at the hands of Fredericton City Council, way back in 1895, this bill called the Elections Act was passed. This is 11 years after New Brunswick was founded, and the voting rules at this time were remarkably liberal, if you were a man. Basically, in the beginning, any man could vote regardless of their income, their religion, their race. This might not sound like much to us today, but back then, only a tiny minority of rich property owners could vote normally throughout much of the world. So allowing men to vote if they were poor or a racial or religious minority was pretty genuinely shocking for the time. I actually couldn't come up with any other examples of such a liberal and progressive voting rules anywhere in the world at that specific moment. So that was just for the first 11 years, though. Then this thing called the Elections Act came in 1795, and it aimed to change that. It took the right to vote away from a lot of men, including poor men, black men, and Catholic men, which was a sneaky one because that managed to take out Acadians and Irish all at once. Indigenous men were actually allowed to vote under this law as long as they didn't live on reserves. but most did live on reserves, so, yeah. This right to vote would be taken away in 1899, and it wasn't given back until, get this, 1963. So Indigenous men would have gotten the right to vote back around when the Beatles came over, to put that on timelines. So you note that all of these people that I just mentioned had one thing in common. All these people that were just newly banned, they were all men. Women were not banned from voting. And I guarantee you this is absolutely 100% not intentional. I asked Elections New Brunswick about this. I think they probably thought that was a pretty weird question they got. So Elections New Brunswick, of course, is the body governing elections today. And they said, although women were not specifically excluded from voting at first, this seems to have been more of an omission than reflective of the intent to allow women's right to vote. So to translate this from civil servant speak into plain terms, they forgot women. I was talking to Jean Armstrong this morning, and she thought that was kind of funny too, and then she thought about it for like 2 seconds, and she was like, that's really sad. They forgot we existed. But that's pretty much what happened. So since women weren't actually banned from voting, some New Brunswick women actually did vote way back in the 1700s. So the academic Elspeth Tulloch wrote in her seminal book about New Brunswick's battle for equal rights called We the Undersigned that
evidence does exist to suggest that a few women in New Brunswick, most certainly white women of certain means, did in fact exercise the franchise in the years between the first electoral legislation of 1795 and the revised legislation of 1843, when the franchise was finally and clearly restricted to men.
So at that time, women voting was pretty much unheard of anywhere in the world. But I do need to preface that with the caveat that this is I'm very narrowly talking about a Eurocentric Western view, right? I need to note that before Europeans came to North America, there's plenty of evidence saying that assorted forms of democracy and women participating in these democracies existed in North America before the Europeans arrived. I found an interesting written account by a French nun named Mary Goyart that was explicitly talking about Iroquois women voting.
These female chieftains are women of standing amongst the Iroquois, and they have a deciding vote in the councils. They make decisions there like the men.
But in this Western tradition, though, women are only first allowed to vote fairly recently. So a quick overview of democracy. So 2,531 years ago, ancient Athens, democracy started. Only for men, though. You have to wait a couple years until women can. The first one was 1718, so it was more than a couple years, and that was in Sweden, the Age of Liberty. So certain women were allowed to vote. The second example was 1755 in the short-lived Revolutionary Republic of Corsica. They didn't only have women voting, they had human rights records, all these things like that. They were a big inspiration to the United States, which they may have forgotten recently. So that's number 1, Sweden, number 2, Corsica, and then number 3 is us. Yeah, so the reason you probably haven't heard of this, or people say it more, academics say it more adamantly, is because we don't have any written records of women being like, today I voted. But in my opinion, we have something which is really just as good, which are records of men complaining about women having voted. So, for example, there's one annoyed male voter who wrote into Kent County's newspaper, which is called the Gleaner in Northumberland. She's Diasma. We had very crazy newspaper names. On October 26, 1830, to complain that his preferred candidate had narrowly lost, and this anonymous male complained.
At the close of the poll, Mr. Weldon stood 36 votes ahead of Mr. Jardine, including 4 female votes, the legality of which is doubtful.
But not all men were complaining about women voting either, though. This isn't really a story of men against women. It's kind of a story about rights, and women often had a great deal of support from men for their cause. And one of the more vocal men to support getting women back their right to vote after it was taken away was someone who you as Frederictonians would recognize a street named after him. His name's William Needham. So he was an MLA from Fredericton, and in 1870 he gave a very fiery speech in the legislature recalling how Carleton County women in particular had been very well organized and motivated voters going together to vote in groups. And at the time of the speech, William Needham was trying to pass a law to give women back the right to vote, saying,
Mr. Speaker, I have introduced this bill to restore a privilege that women owning property formerly had in this province. For in years gone by, ladies voted for the members of this House of Assembly. It was not a new principle or an ephemeral thing, but it was a right women had in times past, which was taken away from them.
He told the legislature that all women used to vote in this city's mayoral election, saying,
Even ladies in Fredericton had a vote.
I dug up Needham's old forgotten speech in this big, enormous leather tome in the legislative library. It was like the size of my torso, just covered in dust. And he's reminding the legislature how Fredericton women had lost their right to vote. And he talked about it had happened during this particularly heated Fredericton mayoral election in which Fredericton women had organized and united to vote together to defeat this candidate running for mayor named Judge Fisher. I couldn't actually figure out what specifically the problem was with Judge Fisher in the context of the election campaign, but I once found this letter talking about Judge Fisher, and this is from someone that liked Judge Fisher. This is from a supporter. And he was saying that Judge Fisher lived in a huge mansion out Hanwell Way, I think it was, and he bought up all the farmland around it. And in the letter writer's words, Judge Fisher wanted to create a more genteel society. And this involved basically, you guys know what serfdom is, right? So he had bought up land with farmers on it, and he expected these farmers to work for him and upkeep his mansion for free. And the farmers were like, no, we're moving. So this letter writer, he was in support of Judge Fisher. He thought that New Brunswickers had done a horrible thing by just abandoning this poor man in his mansion and not working for free. So this kind of gives you some context about, I like the awe. So I think that can give you some context about why Fredericton women united to defeat this mayoral candidate named Judge Fisher. But Judge Fisher was furious at his defeat in that mayoral election. He vowed revenge on the women who made him lose this election. He went above the city of Fredericton to his buddies in the legislature to pass an amendment to that old Elections Act that had forgotten about women, to this time explicitly ban them from voting everywhere in New Brunswick. So in his 1870 speech, William Needham then brought up Elizabeth Beard. Now, Elizabeth Beard is another character in my book, Rebellious Women in the Maritimes. Actually, she's pretty resonant for today's time. She had fought in the American Revolution against the Americans. So, yeah, she was like 16 years old, I think, and got a ship she was aboard, a troop ship, got ambushed by Americans, and she mounted the cannons, and she was like tearing strips off of her dress to use as wadding and keep the cannons firing in battle. She ended up settled in Fredericton, actually, and finished up her life there. So this is who William Needham is talking about. By the way, her nickname was the Valiant Amazon, which is a pretty cool nickname. So William Needham talked about how she went into battle, and he said that she wasn't only a battler against Americans, but she was also a voter, saying,
Would anyone say that women should not have the same privilege of voting as her husband had? You would have, with equal propriety, not have allowed her to participate in the fight against the Americans either. I can imagine my honorable friend representing Westmoreland going up to her and saying, "Oh, my dear, don't do that." And her replying, "If you don't like the wadding I'm putting into the gun, then you go up and do it yourself." I want to restore these rights. Elected officials voting on this have to view this question as a matter of right and wrong. Any idiot can go to the polls and deposit his ballot by virtue of being a man. But you deny this right to a woman possessing all the necessary brain to judge right simply because she is a woman.
Yeah. So William Needham's call to restore the right to vote to women that they had taken from them was not well received by his colleagues. As soon as he sat down after delivering his speech, his fellow elected officials stood up in the legislature and they denounced him in the harshest of terms, saying,
"Extremist, troublemaker, demagogue, adventurer, a man not worth a dollar, a radical, disturbed."
But I was kind of thinking when I read this, so William Needham, by the way, he's a big guy, and he's being called these things by his colleagues on the floor of the legislature, right? So I was kind of thinking, how, for these women who had gone in when it was semi-legal at best, right? You would have to kind of argue this law with the sheriffs that were running the polling stations to vote, right? Imagine the intimidation that they would have gone through in order to cast a ballot. And it seems quite daunting. And William Needham had mentioned in his speech that he thought it was a joke, that women from Carleton County would go in together in groups and they would intimidate the sheriff at the polls, right? But I don't think that they were necessarily intimidating them. I think they were more likely traveling in groups because they were concerned for their safety because of reactions like that, right? As for Needham's right to restore women's lost right to vote, this was soundly defeated by a vote of 26-7. When one MLA complained that their wives were going to
thrash them for voting against him,
Needham angrily snapped back,
"Some husbands need a good deal of thrashing, and especially those of you in this House of Assembly who voted against this bill."
So William Needham's speech and this failed effort to get women back the right to vote that was way back in 1870. And I don't want to give you the impression that the fight just stopped there, because I'm going to go back to Muriel McQueen Ferguson for narrative purposes, but I kind of just want to emphasize that this continued all the time. There's decades and there's countless people from organizers to other elected officials who got involved in this fight. There was votes on this nearly every year, and some of them would be quite close, unlike that one. Actually, New Brunswick did, 18 years after William Needham's speech in 1868, New Brunswick did successfully pass this. And that was kind of cool too, because the leaders of the Liberals and the Conservatives were both super opposed to this, but backbenchers united to pass this. And it still would have been one of the earliest ones in the world in 1868, but this holdover from colonial times called the Small Governing Council, an unelected body that everyone had kind of forgot about, like a zombie returned to life, and he managed to kill off this bill. So that would be one of the more unfortunate, closer ones. And like a lot of these things, I don't want to say it's just about politicians. There was a lot of grassroots organizing by women themselves, right? St. John, in particular, had a group called the Women's Enfranchisement Association with the iconic leader Ella Hathaway. So in 1909, she came up to Fredericton to talk in support of another bill to allow women the right to vote. And the events that happened that day ended up being the first time in New Brunswick's history that the word sexual harassment ever appeared in a newspaper. So she was supposed to be allowed to talk in favor of this bill in the legislature. So she goes in, and then the MLAs vote to not allow her to speak after she'd been permitted. She had her speech written. So she's up in the rotunda, and she's watching people talk about women's right to vote without participation from women. And these MLAs started writing, and they would write little letters, and they would send the pages up to get them and deliver them to her. And these it was not only just sexist stuff in these letters, it was sexual. This was like explicit sexual harassment in these letters to Ella Hathaway. So what did she do? She took them back to St. John and she published them in the paper. She called out these MLAs and she wrote in this article accompanying it, what would your mothers, your sisters, your daughters, and your wives think of this? Because I think that you are not very impressive men. So back to Muriel McQueen Ferguson. So she is, after all of these years, still trying to get back the right for women to vote. And this is the right, remember, that women had once enjoyed, but had taken away from them. Her extremely modest ask had been rather brusquely rejected. So now what was she going to do? Was she just going to give up? Or was she going to double down and ask for more? She went with the latter option, and she gathered up some other interested women. They formed what they called the Women's Study Group, and her victory poem declared,
"At this the mayor and corporation quaked with a mighty consternation."
These 10 women were the ones that were celebrating Muriel McQueen Ferguson's victory speech. That victory speech, they all signed it. They autographed their victory speech. Their names on that faded yellow piece of paper were Betty Hawkins, Margaret Wilkins, Lillian Corey, Marjorie Thompson, Nora Toole, Margaret Hall, Nellie Moore, Jean Bailey, Samantha Doyle, Hazel Love, and Alice Olton. One of those women, Nora Toole, wrote,
"In civic affairs in Fredericton, the right for all women to vote was achieved only after the Second World War. In this case, it was the woman who worked for and brought about the change. The Women's Study Group is the story of women's franchise in one small Canadian city."
You might think, based on the name Women's Study Group, that they weren't exactly an action-oriented group. But that, in fact, would not be the case. According to their victory poem,
Then into the street the study group stepped, smiling first a little smile, as if they knew what magic slept in their humble petition the while.
This petition's pretty remarkable. It still survives up at the provincial archives in Muriel McQueen Ferguson's stuff. She kept it even after all these years and all this international globetrotting. And then she donated it to the archives. It's not in very good shape. It was clearly shows the effects of being taken around town. You can see marks from where it would have been splattered with ink, or from having gotten wet in the rain, sleet, or snow while the Women's Study Group was going through the streets of Fredericton collecting their signatures. And flipping through it, you see all of these dozens and dozens of pages of listing their names, their signatures, and their occupations.
And ere 3 words of petition they read, you saw as if an army scribbled, and the scribbling grew to a scrawling, and the scrawling grew to a mighty signing, and out of the fountain pens the names came leaking. Great girls, small girls, lean girls, brawny girls, wearing brown hats, black hats, gray hats, tawny hats, grave old plodders, gay young friskers, and even gentlemen in whiskers. Families by the tens and dozens, grandmas, mamas, aunts, and cousins, all had signed their names, 800 the score, and had they not stopped, there would have been more.
So this petition, it cut a swath through the usual divisions in the city. It included supporters who were Protestant and Catholic, Irish and French, Anglican and Baptist, lots of support from the Jewish community. There was wealthier folks, and there were poorer folks. These 10 women began collecting names in February, in the cold winter. In October, they finally presented their petition to the city council. They had, by this point, signed up fully 1/4 of the eligible voters in the city. So according to the minutes from that meeting with city council, their response was,
"The city council promised consideration at a later date."
So, while this doesn't sound wildly encouraging, especially remember how she had been treated the first time she met with the mayor and council, only to be harshly rejected after, it was pretty different her going in alone versus her going in with the backing of a quarter of the electorate behind her. City Council promptly called an emergency meeting. They ultimately decided not to make a decision, though. They decided that the question was one for the provincial government to deal with. So City Council sent along a request to the provincial government. Actually, they requested that women be allowed to vote in Fredericton, but not all women, though. Only housewives. And that was only as long as they didn't get a job outside the house. If they got a job, they would lose the right to vote. So that was the recommendation. So the women's study group wanted the vote for all women, not only housewives who were not otherwise employed. They prepared for yet another fight with the provincial government, and they began quickly establishing franchise women's study groups, so to speak, all over New Brunswick. So for those of you who are not aware of the geography of Fredericton, there's like 4 blocks between City Hall and the legislature. So the politicians over at the legislature were well aware of this organizing that this group was doing, and they were well aware that women's study groups were being formed elsewhere, and they were quite frightened of this. So they were observing that this little group of 10 women had slowly built up support to the point where they had become a well-organized steamroller. So as soon as the women's study groups pivoted to take them on, the legislature gave up. They gave women whatever they wanted. So in record time, they managed to pass a law allowing women to vote. Actually, I should probably be more specific here since we have multiple MLAs. I think it was an amendment to a law, and I'm not sure it was actually a record. It was 1 month to the day they took this, so you guys would be able to tell me whether or not that's a record, but I think we're pretty speedy here, right? Yeah, okay, we have a thumbs up, so record-breaking.
Although we're pretty speedy now, too.
Yeah, so it was 1 month between when Fredericton City Council tried to throw the provincial legislature under the bus until it was finally allowed to vote after all of this time. Or, as this poem phrased it,
Last came the reading of the bill to amend the Act, and what had been a hope became an accomplished fact.
So this was at the time the most progressive voting record in the country. See, because there wasn't any restrictions on this new voting thing. It was basically, there was none of this housewife stuff or otherwise employed. It was, if you were a woman living in any city or town in New Brunswick over the age of 21, you could vote. That was it. Whereas all of these other places had restrictions. Remember, it was only housewives still in Halifax and Charlottetown. So New Brunswick had suddenly leapt to the top, just like that. The legislature was in a big hurry, though, because they were still somewhat intimidated by this women's study group in Fredericton. And Fredericton had a municipal election coming up. So there was still one thing left, because this is, it took a very long fight for these women to get the right to vote finally, but then there was a major loophole. Women were still not allowed to run for city council. So they could vote in this, but they weren't allowed to run. So they had another battle on their hands to organize. So the existing city council in Fredericton, as this might not shock anyone, they were opposed to allowing women to run. And then once again, this women's study group organized a slate of candidates, which is basically like a political party, to run what would turn out to be one of the more vicious elections in the city's history. Mainly over this question over whether or not women should be allowed to run for office. They recruited a slate of men who backed women's voting rights. They called themselves the opposition slate, and in a really strange twist that I don't quite understand, these long-time 6-term re-elected mayor and council called themselves the progressive slate. I don't know, they weren't particularly progressive, but anyways. So on election day, most of the old city council that had been in were resoundingly defeated in an election which saw a record turnout. So that election happened January 12th, 1948. So this was a long way of getting back from what Eric McGarity had asked me. So the actual answer for his pub trivia question that he poked me at in the archives is January 12th, 1948. So I'll have to tell Eric. But
we'll let him know.
But anyway, so this set the stage for Muriel McQueen Ferguson's press conference in which she boasted her running would
cause a lively election.
However, by this point, she was considered such a formidable opponent that nobody would even run against her. So it wasn't long after her victory that we see the immediate impact of actually having women as elected officials. Nora Toole, who was one of the leaders of the Women's Study Group, recounted an incident that took place shortly after Ferguson had become the first woman member of City Council.
I'd like to tell you the story of another incident which happened in Fredericton just last December. The Finance Committee of the City Council has introduced a bylaw providing for an annual increase in the wages of civic employees, a straight $100 a year pay boost for men and $50 for women. The City Council is meeting, and one member, Muriel Ferguson, who is Fredericton's first women alderman, rises in her place. She brands the proposed increase for women rank discrimination and moves that all civic employees be given the same rate of increase, regardless of sex.
So this would be that pivotal moment that would catapult her onto the national stage. Later, the international stage. It seems so obvious to us now, right? That it would not be acceptable to give two people doing the same job, one of them a $100 raise because he's a man, and one of them a $50 raise because she's a woman, right? But oddly enough, going by news reports, the men who presented this pay raise option when they got called in by Muriel McQueen Ferguson to explain themselves were actually really surprised that this was considered sexist and discriminatory. The city manager explained to Muriel McQueen Ferguson that they were
only carrying out the practice that has been enforced for years.
So not only did Muriel McQueen Ferguson win this fight for an equal pay rise for city employees, but this was the moment that she really converted a lot of her critics. For example, Fredericton's Daily Gleaner newspaper had spent an awful lot of time criticizing her. However, even they were finally won over by this issue. They published an editorial that said,
"From time to time, we have found ourselves unable to support policies backed by Alderman Muriel Ferguson. We doff our hat to her now for her spirited defense of the sex which she so aptly represents in the City Council chamber. As Mrs. Ferguson pointed out, increases should not be based on whether the employee was a man or a woman, but on his or her qualifications. To do otherwise, she maintained, was rank discrimination, and we agree with her. There can be little question Mrs. Ferguson has turned out to be the most able member of City Council. Her views are always worth listening to, and she's never dull."
So Muriel McQueen Ferguson wouldn't remain on Fredericton City Council for very long. Only 2 years later, she would be appointed to the Senate. And she would be the first ever woman to represent New Brunswick in the Senate, and she would later go on to become the first woman in Canada to become Speaker of the Senate. And it was in this position she really used to the best that it could be to become this high-profile advocate for the most marginalized people in society. She focused her energy on helping people who were often forgotten and looked down on in society. She fought for the rights of desperately impoverished elderly women, of single mothers, of orphan children, and she was an outspoken advocate for the rights of women prisoners. And the fascinating thing about her is that she stood up for people not only in Canada, but internationally. As a senator and the Speaker of the Senate, she traveled far and wide all over the world advocating for better treatment of the elderly and women prisoners. And in her boxes of stuff, she kept a lot of press clippings from these tours. So it was really she kept them from other places she traveled to when she was working for the Senate, right? So these aren't local or Canadian. There are ones from Tokyo, there are ones from Colombia, there's ones from the Soviet Union, New Zealand, Poland, Iran, depicting her particularly unique ability to, she would attend high-level functions, you know, those like fancy diplomatic balls, right? And with these local leaders, and then she would drag these powerful foreign government officials to their nation's local prisons, orphanages, hospitals, and different institutions for the disabled. So these officials would see firsthand the conditions these marginalized people in their own countries lived in. But despite all of these later accomplishments of hers, which helped so many people around the world, and she said that all of this was owed back to her work with the Women's Study Group and with her time on the Fredericton City Council. And she stated that,
"My own opportunity, I feel, was due mostly to involvement in women's and welfare organizations and being an alderman in my home city."
Thank you.
Let's give another round of applause to our amazing cast tonight. That was fantastic. And it was so nice being in the crowd listening to that, because I'd read the story already with my own private, like, oh, that's interesting. And to hear the little, oh, what? No. In the crowd live was very exciting. So a fascinating story with so many layers to it. And I'm just, because I know you do this research so deeply on these stories, and you're probably got your head in the archives a lot. And so when you just, describe pulling out like this yellowed like petition, with like ink splatters on it and watermarks, and reading it for the first time. What is that moment like for you when you find these gems that make up the story?
I've never found any like actual pirate's gold, but I feel like it's probably the same thing.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun. I think that the research is the really fun part. The editing is the less fun part that comes after. But yeah, I feel like it's like a dig, right? And you don't really know where these things are necessarily going to take you. It's just like pulling a thread, right? And sometimes even the stories themselves will come up in odd ways. Like I didn't think I would be going back as far when I was asked that question by Councillor McCarity. I didn't think I'd go back to 1795, but anyways, it was like a fascinating story. And I don't know, I feel like sometimes I'm just like a little kid that's like pulling at their parents' pant leg and being like, hey, you want to hear about this cool thing I found out? And that's kind of like what I'm doing with that. It's kind of what it amounts to. I'm telling you a cool story that I found.
Yeah, and Muriel McQueen Ferguson, if you're from Fredericton, her name is so familiar to people. But for you, did you know much about her before you started researching?
No, not at all. I didn't even know she was a woman alderman, as the phrasing was at the time.
Yeah.
It seemed like, she was very much a larger-than-life person. So it was kind of like, I guess I kind of assumed she was just magically always this large figure. But so kind of the young prequel to the life of Muriel McQueen Ferguson was very exciting.
Yeah, larger than life and so audacious for her time. Like here's this woman who is just 80 years ago, really. She's not taking no for an answer. She's collecting signatures. She's marching these women to the ledge. She's people are terrified of running against her. Like, what's the sense you got going through your research of the reception that Muriel was getting in Fredericton? What was there? People kind of thinking she's too audacious, or rah rah go Muriel?
I think she was very good at cultivating allies, and I think that she was actually very disappointed when no one ran against her. Like when she had her first press conference and she said it was going to be an exciting election, I think that she was really relishing it, and she'd pack the room with all these supporters and cheering crowds and stuff like that, but I guess it was too much, and she freaked out the opposition. But she was definitely very meticulous, right? When I don't know how many people go to talk to city council and communicate with every attorney general in the country beforehand to have all of these letters in hand. But, there's certainly a huge level of digging into things on her part before she says anything, which is very impressive.
Yeah. Mayor Rogers, for you, you grew up in Fredericton, so you know Muriel's name. But when did you start learning more about her?
So many of us associate her with the Muriel McQueen Ferguson Foundation and Center that's on campus, and so very familiar with her work with intimate partner violence. I would have known as a political science student, that intrigued her story, even in that regard, intrigued me. I then became aware of a more social activism in which she was involved. She truly was a social activist and truly did fight the cause for marginalized populations, and so I was aware of that. Was not aware of, and knew that she was a senator, was always aware of Senator Ferguson and first female speaker of the Senate, so knew that, did not know her political history, her municipal political history in particular, until a time when I too became challenged, and some in the audience might remember my second term on council. I was the only woman on council and was very frustrated by that. And the quote that I read that really resonated about, it's not just because it's my right to be here for women. It's not just that it's women's right, it's the women's contributions and what women will contribute if we are here. And recognizing that term on council, we were making, I felt, some less than good decisions because we didn't have enough women represented, enough diversity in general at the table, but enough women represented on council. So I began doing some of my own research. At my swearing in on council, I spoke, it had been 70 years since she was first elected to council. So actually at my swearing in, I had done some research, found out she was part of this larger group of women who were able to get women the vote, and then who fought so that women could then run for council, and then she was the first woman to be elected. And so I had just uncovered all of that, and I spoke to it at my swearing in, and also said, in the ensuing years, only 12 women had been elected to Fredericton City Council. So for all of the advancement that they made in that time, the following 70 years were, not too much to be celebrated. I was the 12th woman to be elected to Fredericton City Council in 2012. So when I was elected as mayor in 2021, 4 additional women came onto council. So now there's 16 women who've been elected to Fredericton City Council since Muriel McQueen Ferguson. So, yes. And it does feel odd to cheer for that because the number should be much larger. Yeah. But nonetheless, it was an accomplishment. And and I don't want to take up too much time, but as I was listening to how the effort that Muriel McQueen Ferguson made, I was thinking of when I came out in 2018 and spoke to the challenges of being the only woman on council and how that was impacting decision making. I felt women in this, and I was like, I'm done. Like, this is crazy. I'm not going to reoffer. It was women in the community who, and I didn't want to be done, but I thought, I can't continue like this. It was women who stepped forward and said, you have to continue, and we have to get you more women. Like, we need more women. There were also men in the community. There were some elderly men who reached out and called me on the phone who said, it's a sin, it's a shame that there have not been more women. You've got to run. We got to get some other women running. Like, people rallied. So it is amazing, I think, when you put yourself out there on a cause, how you can bring others along, or how, maybe it's not you, the cause resonates so much that others come along and join. And so that story of Muriel McQueen that you share about how she brought others, that women's group, the work study group, I was not familiar with that story. And I find that is really empowering for all of us and really inspirational. And it's a cry to the importance of being involved.
Well, and what obstacles do you think still stand in the way for women to get involved in politics? And I kind of want to hear from Cassandra as well on this, but first you, Mayor.
So it's interesting, the women, I was always one who said, to me, the obstacle wasn't so much, and I realize I speak from a certain perspective, so I don't represent the voices of all women. When I looked and saw what are the barriers of involvement, there are certainly some of this obvious socioeconomic barriers. Another barrier is that table isn't a table where women want to sit sometimes. It's not, I feel we're making improvements, but it is not always collegial. It is quite oppositional. There is still much misogyny. Men have gotten very clever. I don't mean all men, but many men have gotten very clever in masking their misogyny, but it is still there. A lot of men, when you're at that table, it's what you bring is not valued in the same way. You are still seen as one-dimensional. It cannot be imagined by many men in other positions of authority that women bring multiple things to the table, that they have various experiences that they bring. So for me, the barrier wasn't getting there. It was, the barrier is creating a space where women want to be and where diverse populations want to be.
And Cassandra, something else I'm thinking about too in this day and age is the specter of being online, of we hear those stories a lot of women being discouraged from joining politics or getting driven out of politics. We've seen those examples because it can be really nasty, right? So what are your thoughts on that, about just the obstacles that still stand in the way for women who want to get involved in politics?
Yeah, so I'd say my first is just representation matters. It does matter. I know I've told Kate this many times, but I don't know if she really understands how pivotal she was in me deciding to run for city council. It was because of your article in CBC and the words you spoke about needing more women at the table that I was inspired by your words. I was inspired by seeing a strong woman in my community stepping up and speaking out. And I thought, well, why not me? And I remember sitting with you at a coffee shop to try to understand more what I was getting myself into. I definitely had no idea what I was getting myself into. But yeah, so one thing I'd say is just representation. I needed to see myself in that space. And I think that's kind of what Kate is talking about, is a lot of times you don't see yourselves in those spaces because you're not represented and you're not kind of seeing a mirror image in that space. So for a long time, I never really thought about it. But when I saw, Kate coming out and talking about how little women were involved in municipal politics, I thought, well, that's a shame. In 2021, I think it was, I thought, that's crazy. I want to run. And then since I think I have kind of the added layer of, I was the youngest woman ever elected in Fredericton. So my kind of viewpoint has been not just a woman, but also being much younger than some of my counterparts, and being kind of both of those things sometimes playing against me. I'd say it's been hard. Social media is brutal. I've had, abusive phone messages left on my phone, calling me this, that, and the other thing, and talking about my age and the fact that I'm a woman. I've had people say horrible things about me online, and it is really difficult. And I can definitely resonate with what Mayor Kate said. You often feel dismissed. I know some of my colleagues don't feel that way about me and are very, listen to what I have to say, just like I listen to what they have to say, and try to really be open and listening to people. But there are a lot of times, whether it's, your colleagues or residents in the community or other places you end up in, you do have people sometimes treat you a lot differently than your male colleagues. And you have to put up with certain comments, and you have to put up with certain ways people kind of talk to you or talk down to you. And I've had the experience of being the only woman in a meeting, and all the men were talking around me and weren't actually talking with me, even though I was the representative in the room. So it can sometimes be really hard. I will say my eyes were opened becoming a city councillor in Fredericton. I do think the biggest challenge we face with women is staying in politics. It's not a secret. I don't plan to reoffer. And there's a lot of reasons why, and definitely one of them is how challenging it is to be put out in the public and to have people attack you very vocally and very viciously, to have your name dragged through the mud on social media in your small town you've lived in almost your entire life. It can be really hard, and it can be really hard to have your integrity questioned always, especially when you care so much about what the work you're doing and your community. And so it is, I think, our biggest challenge in society is getting women to stay.
Thank you so much for sharing all that. And David Coon, you played, is it William Needham? Is that his name? William Needham.
I am William Needham.
Yes. And did you and Luke have to fight over who would play the ally versus the
No, Matt made that decision for us.
Man?
I was told sexiest man, so
Yeah.
I was like, it's going to be a tough sell with David
Right.
Coon on stage with me, but I'm going to take a stab at it.
Yeah. I thought you guys had to, rock, paper, scissors over that one or something. But David, so you played the role of this man. It's a remarkable story, really, about in 1870.
Yeah.
Him standing up for women and saying, I love that line. It's something like, men are idiotic too, and they cast ballots or something. Why can't women, Anyways, what did you, in terms of his role, what strikes you about his role in this story, I guess, and at the time that he is saying these things?
Well, I mean, I think in every era you have politicians who go against the flow, who stand up, like, when I say the flow, what the kind of dominant thinking is in the legislature or out beyond in society, and he was one of those politicians, and good on him. So I didn't know the story, that part of the story at all, and so it's always good to discover these politicians who stand up and say the right things and fight for the right things. So it doesn't matter whether it's 1837 or whenever it was, or 2025. It's been, we think of history in a bit as if it's some other world, when really it's not. It's just our world before, and so we see some of the same things. There are people who will stand up and fight for what's right, and there are other people who will defend the status quo till their death, and so that has never changed, and I think it's always been the same. And in his case, one of the things I thought was, it's a shame that he didn't win the fight, that he didn't get his bill passed, and it took many years after that for it to happen. But and it was defeated roundly, as you saw with the numbers. But even so, that legacy, as these things always do, help create the foundation for those who come later to actually make the change.
Well, how important do you think it is that men see this fight for women's equality as their fight too?
Oh, it's essential. It's incredible to think about the fundamental differences. We're talking about, what Cassandra has been facing and other women politicians. I was in Tantramar and Sackville with Megan Mitton, who's our MLA from there, and we're just walking down the sidewalk when some guy kind of races by and starts shouting at her on the street about how terrible she is, and moves on, and it's like, what the hell? So, and that happens, it wasn't just a one-off thing. She gets the social media hate and the phone calls and the stuff on the street that happens, and some men who kind of follow her in a way to every opportunity they get to try and tear her down. It's been an education for me, that's for sure. Being so close to Megan and in our work in the legislature and as members in the party, deputy minister, deputy leader, I should say. and to sort of over the last number of years see this reality that she's living every day as a woman in politics is eye-opening. So we have a huge responsibility.
Luke, do you want to add anything to that, or are you witnessing some similar things in that respect?
Speaking to my colleagues, the House itself, I just want to go back to what the mayor mentioned in terms of the council chambers. When I speak to my colleagues, they have a very different experience in the House too. Just the nature of the House and how oppositional it is. It's just a different emotional experience.
What are you talking about?
It's a different experience, and I think that when you look at the history of the House, we were talking about it here on stage. I was actually the voice of someone who was, bringing harsh words against one of the members, and it's a really difficult place for women to be. And I think when we're talking about the story and we're talking about voting rights, and we're looking at what's happening in the world around us, I think this is an important piece of history to be sharing. The fact that rights existed in the 1700s, they were taken away. Further rights were taken away in the 1800s, and then it took, in one case, hundreds of years, in another case, 70, 80 years to bring back those voting rights. I think it's especially important to remember these stories and to understand the advances that we've made can slip backwards really quickly. So what changes do we need to make in council chambers and the legislature, and what changes do we need to make so that people like Cassandra will run that second term? Because I think those voices are critical now to be able to keep basic fundamentals like voting rights.
Well, some of those milestones you talk about, it makes you realize how fraught the history of suffrage is in this country. Like when Andrew was talking about you'd mentioned at some point in your story that it wasn't until 1963 that Indigenous people in New Brunswick had the right to vote in provincial elections. That's like almost 15 years after, the story of Muriel. So, Luke, when we're talking about all this fraught history, how should we reckon with that? And how much work do we still have to do?
I think we've come a long ways when we think about voting rights, and I don't think we can ignore that. I think we need to celebrate the distance that we've come. I'm a gay member of the House. I'm sitting with members of council and a mayor who are women. We've come a long ways. I think the work is partially celebrating where we've come, but understanding that you just have to turn on the news and understand that that's under threat. There's been voting rights changes in the States already. There's more that people are talking about there, and there's certainly chatter about alignment with those values here in Canada. So I think making sure that we're keeping those relationships going amongst us all and keeping those conversations going, attending events like this to understand where we are and what we have to protect. I mean, there's, yes, a lot of work to do, but I think there's a lot of work to do to keep what we've gotten.
Just another thing I want to mention about this story, and I want to bring you into this, Fawn, is just the wonderful poetry that we see in this, that Muriel's friends lovingly write for her at her victory party. And when you read this poetry in the context of the fight for women's right to vote, what did you think of those words?
I think what stood out to me reading the poem was sort of the bravery of writing so triumphantly, almost before the word earned isn't the right word, but before they could be confident, I think they just led with confidence. And I was thinking about my role as Poet Laureate and how sheepishly I sort of enter my poems, and I'm often afraid to write something celebratory or bold, and maybe that does play into the gender and the criticism. But I just really admired the way the poem was it had exclamation marks and really took up space and the long lists, and the language was just very strong. And I found that sort of shifted how I think about what a poem can be, especially a political poem and the kinds of poems I'm thinking about writing in my term.
Yeah, how do you approach the role? You've been Poet Laureate now for a year or so, right?
Coming up to a year in the fall, half a year.
Yeah.
Somewhere between 0 and 1 year.
Well, it's just, I love that, do you think there's a unique power that poetry has in moments like this to affect change?
I do, yeah. I'm biased, obviously, but I think I was just talking to David about this, I think it's everything. And I think if we don't fund the arts and foster community and artistic circles and events like this, all of the life drains out of everything. And then you have to ask yourself what we are fighting for. Why do we want voices to be heard? Why do we want to gather in spaces? And I think art is sort of inside of all of that. It's the spirit in things. It's expression and communication. And so I think having the poem sort of spread out through that story was really powerful in that same way, injecting it with those moments of just lightness and life and creativity.
Just to wrap things up, Mayor Rogers, I'll give you the last word. I'm just curious to know, when you think about someone like Muriel McQueen Ferguson, what would you say her lasting legacy is today?
So the first thing I think of trailblazer. So that's when you say Muriel McQueen Ferguson, to me, she is a trailblazer. The legacy is we cannot stop being trailblazers. That even just, I think of the different waves of feminism and the breaking of glass ceilings and all of that, but it doesn't stop. Like we can't rest on laurels. We can't. Yes, we elected a woman mayor and 4 women to council. That could stop next term. It could go back to being an all-male council. It could. We are losing. I do fear for the rights we will lose because of the rights that we're seeing lost across the border. That all of those. So it just. I think of. To me, she is an icon as a trailblazer, and she motivates me to even just revisiting this story. Through preparing for this, I was motivated because you do this work gets heavy and you lose your gumption. Like you kind of really do. You lose your spark. Sometimes you forget why you got in it in the first place. And so hearing her story is a reminder of how important it is to stay at the forefront. Let's continue to blaze new trails for new people and new voices, because we need those voices. We need those perspectives. Let's blaze new trails of safety and security for people who are in public spaces. There are more trails to blaze. And so her legacy for me is she was a trailblazer, and I think she inspires us all to continue in her path and her journey.
Thank you so much, everybody. So interesting. And thanks to Matt for putting on this great event. And to all of you for coming.
That was Backyard History with your host, Andrew McLean. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for another hidden story that happened in your own backyard. Produced by Jordan Lozier.